Hi, Dr. P here, and I'm going to talk about ways to encourage alliances and betrayals, and of course, on the opposite, ways to discourage. So this is about games of conflict, games where there's a high degree of interaction amongst the players, and where there are more than two sides. Of course, many multi-sided conflict games have little negotiation. The question is, what can a designer do to encourage alliances and possibly betrayals? In other words, to encourage negotiation. Well, the first thing you have to remember is a lot depends on what the players are used to. Tabletop Euro-style players who are accustomed to little player interaction rarely think in terms of alliance or even cooperation with one another in a competitive game, let alone betrayal. On the other hand, veteran diplomacy players may think in terms of negotiation no matter what the game. Video game players, and we have to recognize many tabletoppers are also video gamers, rarely encounter player-to-player negotiation in video games. So these people are going to play the way they're used to, and the designer has little control over that. Now, looking at it from the player's point of view, if the player feels outnumbered, that the odds are against him or her, then the player is more likely to use negotiation to try to even things up. On the other hand, if the game models some reality, a history especially, then what happened in reality can influence the players. Modern, that is to say post-1500 European history, for example, often involves frequent wars and shifting alliances and betrayals. So if the game is modeling something from that period in Europe, then the players may be more likely to indulge in alliance and betrayal and negotiation. Now, what about asymmetry and symmetry? In case you're not familiar with those terms, symmetry means everybody starts with the same position, essentially, and asymmetry means they start with different positions. One way to avoid an alliance game is make your game significantly asymmetric. That is, each player has a different position and different problems. Now, diplomacy is asymmetric technically, but the intention was to have every player start with an equivalent position. In comparison with that, I'm going to use my own game, Britannia, which is ferociously asymmetric in its starting positions and in its positions throughout the game, with more invasions coming as the game goes on. Also, Britannia is a point game that's focused on specific territories, so it involves competition for points in individual locations. And when that competition is there, perhaps alliances and betrayals are less likely. Asymmetry, on the other hand, means players can complement their strengths and cover for the other's weaknesses when they're in alliance. So, who knows? It varies. It depends on the individual game. Now, many of the more abstract games are symmetric. For example, Risk. Everyone starts with essentially the same situation. That's not exactly true for the random French setup in Risk, but it's still fairly close. With symmetric games, players may feel they have to negotiate because they have no inherent advantage. Now, if you want alliances and negotiation, make your game one where players can easily help each other directly, yet are also competing directly. And if you think about it, that is rare in games. A brilliant mechanism here is the support order in diplomacy, which lets one player's army help another player's army or fleet attack somewhere. And when you combine this with simultaneous adjudication, that makes it even stronger. So we could say maybe you should abandon turn order, because alliances and betrayal are more likely in games that abandon traditional turn order and so allow for more surprise. Betrayal tends to be based on surprise. Diplomacy uses simultaneous adjudication. And that, of course, is much easier to achieve in video games than it is in tabletop games. Committed intent is another method. What committed intent is each player has an identical deck of cards that have various actions they can take, and they play them one at a time face down and turn them all up, and they're played in initiative order. So until all those cards are turned up, you don't know what anybody else is going to do, and you don't know when they're going to do it. And that allows for more surprise than simple turn-based games. Game of Thrones, the board game, uses a unique method of semi-simultaneous action involving placing counters in each area that has an army or fleet, and then those are played out, turned over, and revealed and played out in a certain order. Risk and Britannia, on the other hand, are turn-based. Now, Britannia is somewhat different because each player plays at several different junctures according to when their individual nations play, and they control more than one nation. Still, I would say turn-based games make it less likely that there will be alliances and betrayals. Now, secrecy, of course, is the number one way to encourage alliances and especially betrayals. If negotiation is limited to over the table, as it is in Britannia, alliances are much less likely because the other side can hear what you're going to do. There's no surprise. Surprise is the key. Now, a few games have a limited number of opportunities to negotiate secretly. For example, a game called Feudal. You have 3 tokens. You can play one of those tokens and then go off for a secret negotiation, but you've used up that token. And of course, a big influence in general is designer via the rules. Alan Calamer wanted diplomacy to be about alliance and betrayal. I don't want Britannia to be about that. History is more important. A zero-sum game will be more likely to involve alliances. That is, a game where the only way to gain something is to take it from someone else. Now, this again is done in diplomacy. There are 34 supply centers. Each is able to support one army or fleet. So there are 34 units on the board at a maximum. When you capture a supply center, you can then gain a unit, but the losing player loses a unit. Well, this works in general with maintenance economies, but not with cumulative economies. Now, what are those? A maintenance economy is some where you have to pay for your existing units before you can have new ones. A cumulative economy lets you use your economic power to build more units regardless of how many you already have. So the maintenance economy is closer to zero sum. Make your game an odd number of players to begin with rather than even, because that gives it a more fluid situation. 4 players can devolve into 2 against 2, especially in symmetric games. Now, we're not counting 2 players because that's not multisided, and there's no opportunities for alliances. 6 players generally is much more fluid than 4, because if it devolves into 3 groups of 2, you still have 3 fundamentally, and so that's not going to be stable. Now, I have designed but not marketed a couple games that formalize alliances. You can even force a non-aggression pact with another player by playing a card. You must have declared war with a card in order to fight someone. That's a very different kind of thing than what I've been talking about. But certainly games are going to exist of that sort. So there's no formula you can follow. It's about a combination of things. Thanks for listening.